Welcome to All Workforce Matters. I'm Teresa Miele, your host from the Rutland Region Workforce Investment Board. Welcome. We have David Harlow from Downs, Rachlin, and Martin with us today to talk about some legislative updates, and welcome. Welcome back, actually.
Yeah, thank you for having me back.
So there's a lot going on, and you're here to enlighten us. Why don't you start us off by talking about some of the things that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, I'll do my best. Starting, I guess, with what's happened in the past year, 2017. It's been a busy year on the employment law front at the state and national level. But looking at the state first, a couple of big developments. One, we had the first year of the implementation of the paid sick leave law, which went into effect January 1 of last year, and will continue to progress and go into effect for small employers with 5 or fewer employees starting January 1 of the coming year, 2018. We also had the ban the box law go into effect in July of 2017, and as you may remember from our last segment, that's the statute that prevents employers from asking about criminal history in employment applications.
Yes. That's one of the things that I think trips employers up a little bit. I think larger employers who have a human resources department are on top of this, they're involved, so they're getting notifications. But I noticed that smaller employers aren't aware that they need to remove that question unless they're in that special category, which very few fall into the group of employers that can ask that information. So I think that's particularly important and should have had that off their application, as you said, by July 1st. I think the other thing that I notice as well with the smaller employers and the Vermont sick leave law, they tend to check the box off, oh, I'm offering a benefit. I don't need to worry about this. And if they have a handbook, making sure that they have enlightened their employees about, yes, we already comply with this law, and knowing that they actually do, updating their handbook, because it also includes reasons that employees can take time off beyond what their current policies may have. So still need to look at it, and then we have even smaller employers who are responsible for complying with that law, as you said, January of 2018. So that next move forward.
Right, and for the most part, in my experience, the paid sick leave law, the transition to it, has been fairly easy for most employers, precisely because they were already offering some PTO, paid time off,
Yes.
benefit that really encompassed all that the law actually requires. The details of it, though, need some attention, because if you do have a policy that provides for that PTO benefit, you have to make sure that it includes the specific reasons for the leave that are covered under the paid sick leave law. So with some minor adjustments, I found that most employers have been able to comply with the law with relative ease.
Yes, I agree. So what's new for 2018 that we should be looking forward to?
Well, there's a number of things. Starting on the state level, there will be a new law on the books effective January 1, 2018, involving accommodations for pregnant employees. And what this new law does is basically provide a lot of the same protections for pregnancy as are already on the books for disabilities. Formerly, pregnancy wasn't classified as a disability under the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act, and it still isn't under this statute. But what this statute does do is ensures that employees who are pregnant can seek accommodations from employers that allow them to continue to perform the essential functions of their job while being pregnant. So some examples might be getting a stool to help support an employee who otherwise would have to stand at a cashier's station or something, or getting some kind of different uniform for an employee that has to wear a uniform. So those are the types of things that the law is intended to provide for, and ultimately it's to help create some more balance in the workforce and make it easier for women to stay in their job while they're pregnant.
It is interesting to me that these sorts of things come up because my experience with employers that by far and above employers are already
Right.
doing these sorts of things.
Right.
So I think that it causes folks to kind of take a step back and say, wait a minute, this seems a little bit silly that we have to legislate this when, you know, employers and employees overall have a really good relationship and are already working these things out.
I agree. Apparently the Vermont legislature thinks otherwise.
I'm sure they've heard a couple of stories
I think
that
so.
have required them to take notice, I guess, and take action.
I guess so, yes. Some other areas where they may be taking action. We've heard from members of the Vermont Senate that they look to making the minimum wage increase to as much as $15 an hour a real priority in the coming legislative session. So that's something that may be afoot. There's no law on the books that will require it to increase to $15 at this point, but it may be something that the legislature works on. The Vermont minimum wage does increase, however, incrementally to $10.50 effective January 1 of 2018.
Is this the last year that increases, or is that also progressing?
I believe it will continue to increase based on a calculation that's set, I believe, to account for inflation or some other increment that will provide for a continual increase, but it's not the jump to $15 that's being talked about by some in the legislature.
So obviously there are some advantages when you look at it from an employee perspective with regard to the increase in wages. What are some of the other things that folks should be thinking about? Because we can always look at the pros and why we believe this would benefit, but we also need to consider maybe some unintended consequences that might arise as a result of that.
Well, I think one unintended consequence that may flow from increasing the minimum wage to $15 is that it may cause employers to cut back on hours, because often there really is only so much money that can be used for wages, and if employers are compelled to pay $15 an hour to an employee who would otherwise be making 11 or 12, that may cause the hours for that employee to go from 40 to 35 or to some other number. So that's one consequence that may arise from this. I think another that would be deleterious to employees at this income level is that often an increase in wages can cause them to gain income which prevents them from being eligible for other social benefits. And you may have heard of the benefits cliff.
Yes.
That's a real issue for a lot of Vermonters. And if their wages go up to $15 an hour, they may in fact be worse off if that also means they lose certain other benefits.
I actually had an experience with that with a top-notch employee, and we had a full-time position that she would have loved to take advantage of. Unfortunately, if she took advantage of the full-time position, it would just push her over the top. She would lose her child care, she would have lost her housing, so she ended up in a less desirable position, and we really needed to just work with her to keep that balance because of the benefits cliff. So indeed, the people that we're trying to help, it can be a disadvantage for them, unfortunately.
That's right.
And I would think with the wage shifting, that would be even more of a challenge, because then you're definitely needing to cut someone's hours, which then is a disadvantage for them as well as the employer who had someone to fill the position for all those hours, and they're faced with cutting back the hours because the employee is negatively impacted by that.
Yes, and there's arguments for and against the minimum wage that have been going on for a long time. I know that Senator Tim Ashe has made raising the minimum wage to $15 or some other number a real priority of his, and we'll see where that takes us.
Yes. So what else do we have to look forward to in 2018?
Well, there's some other proposals in the legislature that I think will bubble up. One is paid family leave here in Vermont. There's been proposals to provide for a paid family leave benefit to Vermonters, which would be not just the ordinary unpaid leave that the law already requires, but an additional paid benefit. So that's one proposal that's bubbling up in the legislature. Massachusetts last year enacted a law that prevents employers from inquiring about applicants' salaries in their previous position, with the idea being that that would somehow balance out inequities among the genders in pay, because if a woman's making less at her former employer and she's asked in the application process how much she made, she's probably going to be making a lower amount with her new employer. So we'll see how that law works in Massachusetts, and Vermont often tags along with that type of legislation. So there may be something along those lines as well.
One of the things that I find interesting that really isn't talked about very often in terms of pay equity is, number one, we have laws in effect that make sure that people are fairly compensated regardless of their gender. We don't often talk about kind of what's beneath that. If a woman actually earns less than a man, there are also other factors that play into it. The type of professional industry sector that the person is practicing. So for example, often if you're looking in the medical field, there is data that supports, well, yes, sometimes if you just look at the profession of physicians, there is gender inequity in terms of pay, but then when you break it down to the type of practice, there is an inequity simply because they aren't as high paying of a job. So surgeons' pay is higher than a pediatrician's pay, and more women happen to be pediatricians than surgeons. So there's a lot more to it, and that part of the conversation doesn't seem to surface as much, I think. So we should do a program on that sometime, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot issue, and it's one that employers really have an interest in addressing, because I think most employers want to ensure that their compensation is fair across gender lines, as well as all other lines of any protected characteristic. And if it's not, that can really devastate employee morale and be counterproductive to the employer's interests.
Absolutely.
And some of the ways that employers have gone about trying to develop more equity across lines outside of what's required by the law is, to make salary more transparent, and to pay employees based on a set scale, and to take other measures like that, which are intended to sort of offset the traditional inequity in pay.
Great. So what is going on the federal level?
Well, there's a lot going on the federal level too. One of the areas that's often overlooked or not given the attention that it deserves is what's going on at the National Labor Relations Board. Just this week, the NLRB, as it's called, issued 14 different decisions, all of which I think are of great interest to employers, whether you have a unionized workforce or not. The NLRB being the federal board, an independent agency that oversees and enforces the National Labor Relations Act. It is also probably of some interest to know that the current general counsel for the NLRB is a Vermonter. Peter Robb, a former partner at Downs Rachlin Martin, was nominated and has taken the reins as general counsel and is now the top labor lawyer in the country, enforcing and implementing the NLRA.
Very, very cool.
Yeah. So
something for Vermonters to celebrate, for sure.
For sure, for sure. And some of the things that are going on at the NLRB that would be of interest to employers. One decision that is very recent, within the last week, that comes to mind is a decision involving the Boeing company. and the board in that case was asked to determine whether a rule that prohibited cameras on the work site or at the Boeing facility was in violation of the NLRA. Now, the theory behind that is that if you prohibit employees from using cameras at work, you necessarily prohibit them from documenting and communicating about working conditions that may be unsafe or otherwise something that they should be complaining about. And what the board has said in previous decisions is that those types of no camera rules, as they're called, have a chilling effect on the employee's rights to complain about the terms and conditions of their employment. Those board decisions were decided under an older standard that was developed under the Obama board, which says that if a workplace rule, such as no cameras, could reasonably be construed to have a chilling effect on an employee's rights to engage in protected activities, then it's unlawful under the NLRA. And what this Boeing case did was reverse that standard and say, yeah, it's true that if a rule necessarily limits an employee's ability to communicate about their wages or some other condition of their employment, then it's unlawful. But you also have to take into account the employer's interests. And in this particular case, the employer, Boeing, had a significant interest in ensuring that the very highly sensitive defense-related things that were present at the work site could not be videotaped and then transmitted outside of Boeing. And so I see that development as something that's very important legally, but also practically very important for employers who want to enforce legitimate workplace rules.
That is pretty interesting because that would affect any employer that had any type of trade secret that they didn't want to have communicated forward. Yep. And I think what we're also touching on, which we have been, regardless of what legislation that we've been talking about, is that really important relationship between the employer and the employee, and that it needs to be respectful so that any concerns are brought forward without concern for whether I have a camera or not. Right. That I am able to go to my supervisor or the manager or the president of the company if need be to share any workplace concerns and to really feel that I've been heard and that has been addressed, whether it's found to be a legitimate concern that requires some action, but at a minimum to be heard and to understand why it's actionable or not, but to resolve it.
Yeah, and it's funny that you use the word respectful because a lot of the work rules that were invalidated under the previous standard before this Boeing case involved, employer code of conduct policies that said simply things like employees should work in a harmonious and positive manner and things of that nature. The board had found that those were unlawful rules because they somehow would chill an employee's ability to complain about things or to be negative about working conditions if they so choose. This rule, this new decision under Boeing and the new direction that the board's going in takes that into account, the employee's ability to complain, but also takes into account the employer's interest in enforcing rules that have some significant consequences for their business.
Do you think that overall it's really going to change the working relationship or what's actually going on within companies?
I don't know. I don't know that it's, and I should say that the NLRB changes depending on the party that's in the presidency. And so when a Republican's the president, there's a majority of Republicans on the board. And when a Democrat's president, typically there's a majority of Democrats on the board. And so these types of issues change from administration to administration, and that's not uncommon. But practically speaking, what I do think that this Boeing decision will have an effect on is it will give employers greater latitude in enacting workplace rules that they've got a legitimate justification for business purposes, without concern, or without as much concern that it's going to be somehow found to be in violation of the NLRA. So that's the, I think, practical takeaway from it.
So let's talk a little bit about what's been on the news a lot and on everyone's minds with regard to sexual harassment, allegations, how that affects us in the workplace, or maybe it doesn't affect us in the workplace as much as we think it needs to.
Well, I think with all the recent headlines, it's affected every workplace, and it's become a topic of discussion around the water cooler, and in a lot of ways, that's a very good thing. You know, Vermont's laws and federal laws prohibit sexual harassment and requires that employers have take some affirmative steps to weed out sexual harassment when it occurs. One of the difficulties that a lot of employers face is that the stories that get reported are the ones where somebody really screwed up often, where a human resources professional didn't respond in the way that they should have to stop something, or where a supervisor really did step out of bounds and engage in some inappropriate activity and continued to do it. But what's not reported on are the many, many times when an employee will complain and a human resources professional or manager will take the appropriate steps to stop the behavior. And so that, I think, can be frustrating for a lot of employers with the current climate.
When you think about the sexual harassment and what you may advise employers, supervisors, leaders to be paying attention to, what sorts of advice or what advice would you give?
Well, to take any complaint related to sexual harassment very seriously, to investigate it, and if there's merit to it, to immediately put a stop to it. And depending on the severity and the circumstance, the response in each case may be very different. But I think those are the primary obligations of any employer. And I think employers want to do this. I've heard and read some things in the media that suggest that human resources professionals can be conflicted in some sense because on the one hand they're supposed to be investigating complaints that come in from employees, but on the other hand they're really working for the company, their employer, and so there may be some incentive somehow to not pursue investigations as thoroughly as they should. That may be true in some cases, I don't know, but in my experience it's often the case that human resources professionals are acting in the interest of their employer by investigating and by taking very seriously any complaint that comes to them. Because in the end, the employer that's penalized or may allow some inappropriate behavior to continue is the one that gets in trouble. And so if a human resources professional or anyone is really working in the interest of their employer, they're working to stop and prevent sexual harassment before it occurs.
And I think along with that, what becomes really challenging is that when it is addressed, it isn't something that necessarily can be discussed with the person who has, been on the opposite end, the receiving end of that harassing behavior. So they may get the impression that you've done nothing, and the behavior sometimes could continue and it's not reported again or followed up on, so everyone's thinking, all right, we've done our job, the person is in check, and in essence what they've done is kind of gone under the radar screen a little bit and no one's talking about it because it feels like, well, nobody's doing anything anyway.
Well, an important step in any investigation, I think, is to follow up with the employee who has complained, to explain to them what the outcome of the investigation was. And you're right, if you don't take that step, it may leave the employee with the impression, rightly or wrongly, that you're doing nothing about it. And so I would encourage any employer that does get a report of sexual harassment that be included as one part of the investigation process.
Absolutely. So what other sorts of things are on the horizon that we should be paying attention to, or in addition to what we've talked about?
Well, with respect to the sexual harassment stories, I think that there will be some efforts nationally to address it legislatively. I know that there's been some discussion of passing laws that would invalidate arbitration agreements,
Right.
which are often a vehicle to resolve disputes between employers and employees that's conducted outside of the courtroom and often outside of the public eye. And the theory behind that legislation, or the proposed legislation, is to shed some light on these issues, I think. The same goes for non-disclosure agreements, where you settle a case and it's completely confidential. There's been some talk of passing laws that would limit the circumstances in which you could have those types of agreements when sexual harassment's involved. I don't know that those will get anywhere, but I know that those have been talked about as some possible responses to all this news. I don't know that either of them are a particularly good idea or necessarily helpful, but those have been talked about.
I think the good news, if there is any, in regard to the, what we're seeing and what's coming forth, is that people really are taking a look at behavior in the workplace and outside of the workplace, and looking at, really defining and insisting on courteous, respectful behavior in the workplace. We don't want to discourage all of the really wonderful things that are happening with mentorships and good, strong working relationships between male and female supervisors and the people that report to them. We don't want to lose that in our interest of making sure that people are held accountable for really inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So I'm really glad that you touched on, you need to catch this early and have those conversations when they first arise, instead of ignoring it and hoping it will go away, or maybe not taking it as seriously as you need to in that first conversation, because avoiding it certainly is not a good solution.
Right. I've got a colleague who says that a complaint by an employee is a gift, because it gives the employer some idea that even if there's not really sexual harassment or other unlawful activity happening, that there is some kind of conflict in the workplace that needs to be addressed. And so when you receive a complaint, you also receive some information about how things are working in your organization. And they can be very useful in helping things run efficiently, smoothly, and making your business run more productively.
I really like that. That's a really great way of putting it. And I think it really also underscores that when someone comes forward to share something with you, gives you that gift, it means that you have a good, trusting relationship, or they wouldn't have felt comfortable coming and sharing something that is often very difficult for an employee to share. It's not an easy thing for them to do.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So we have about a minute left. Is there anything that you didn't get a chance to share with us that you wanted to be sure to touch on?
I'm not sure that I do. I think we've covered everything that I can think of at the moment. I mean, there's certainly going to be more developments ahead, particularly at the federal level. I think that the current tax bill debate will come to a conclusion, I imagine, somewhat soon. And where Congress goes from there, I'm not quite sure, but you can be sure that there will be continued developments at the NLRB and at the federal level under the Trump administration to change some of the federal laws that pertain to employment.
Great. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And to our viewing audience, thank you for being with us. And remember that all workforce matters.